Hey, this is Danny with Patrick Adair Supplies, here to make the November ring subscription box. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's go ahead and open up the box. So first things first, this month we have our freebie, which is just a set of our iridescent color pigments. They're essentially just an uncolored daytime, but they have a little bit of a sheen to them. So we have 4 different ones. We have iridescent blue, green, purple, and red. And they're just fun to work with because it adds just a little subtlety to your ring, and you can get just a little bit of a special sheen in there to kind of match your opal or your different inlay materials. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with what we're actually going to be using this month. First thing, we have our ring band. So this month we're going to be using a titanium ring band, and we're going to be using the 6mm just because I think it looks really nice, and we haven't really used it very much in any of our videos. We're going to be sending everybody an 8mm unless you email us and specifically ask for the 6mm width ring band. So if you want one, make sure to send us an email and we can get that switched for you. All right, then we have our Comet Gray Opal, which is just a really nice subtle opal. It's a really kind of muted gray with some hints of orange and red and green, and it's a really cool opal to work with. It's one of my favorites. I think it just looks really nice. Then we're going to be using our purple glow color, which there really isn't all that much to say about it except that it glows purple, so it's fun to work with for that reason. And we're going to be using our lilac purple color pigment, and we're going to be trying to match the daytime color as closely to the glow color as we can. That way it kind of looks like it's glowing all the time. So we're going to be just using a little bit of our lilac, just a hint of it to try and make it a very light purple. And then we're going to be using our Meteorite cores. These are really cool to work with. It's just a big chunk of Meteorite, and we're going to show you how we use it in our different projects. So what we do is we heat it up and then we smash it really thin so that we can cut it into little chunks. So we're going to show you how to make it from this into something you can use in a ring. So it's gonna be really fun to work with. And that's what we have for this month. It's going to look really cool, and I hope you're excited to make it. First step today is going to be to prep some Meteorite chunks. So we're going to be doing that from our Meteorite core that we sell and that we're going to be sending everyone. The best way to use this is honestly just to cut it up into small pieces. And in order to do that, you're going to have to heat it up and smash it. Or at least that's the best way that I've found. Maybe you can find another way that you like better. But the way that we do it here at the shop is we heat it up with a propane torch, and then we hit it with a hammer until it's thin enough to cut with some wire cutters. So I just repeat that process over and over again until I get the piece of Meteorite to a thickness that I know that I can cut with the wire cutters. So everybody's going to be a little bit different on how long this process takes, but for me it usually takes 20 to 30 minutes of just back and forth, heating it up, and then hitting it with a hammer. Now that the Meteorite is thin enough to cut, I'm going to go ahead and take my wire cutters, and the first thing I do is kind of break off fingernail-sized chunks of the Meteorite, and then from there I break it down even further by cutting off the corners of that chunk, just until I get essentially pinhead-sized chunks of Meteorite, just big enough that when I put them into the ring band, they will stick out of the inlay channel, and I'll be able to see them once I finish the ring. For the daytime color, we wanted it to match the ring when it was glowing as much as possible. So we're trying to replicate what the purple glow powder looks like when you've charged it with UV light. So we're just going to use a little bit of the lilac color pigment, just enough that it turns it purple, but that it's not an overpowering color. That's why we chose the lilac, because it is a really nice subtle purple. It still is a really nice color, but it's going to be a little bit more subtle than if we were to use our violet or some of our other purple color pigments. Alright, let's get started with making the ring. The first step, as always, is to put some tape on our ring mandrel. And we're doing this just to help prevent the ring blank from getting scratched. I always do this when I'm working with ceramic or a softer ring blank material such as cobalt or titanium, just to help prevent it from getting damaged while I make the ring. Now let's get started with the inlay. So with that, I'm just going to take our thick CA adhesive and I'm just going to put a little dab of it in the inlay channel. And from there, I'm just going to place one of those chunks of meteorite that I cut. And as I place it, I make sure that part of it is sticking up above the lip of the inlay channel. Just enough so that when I Dremel it down and sand it, it will still be exposed. It won't be hidden beneath any color pigment. And once I've placed that, I lock it into place by just dumping some of the color pigment on top so that it absorbs into the CA and just locks the piece of meteorite down. Alright, now that we have that first piece in, let's go ahead and just repeat that until we're happy with the number of pieces of meteorite that we have. I think I did 8 to 10 pieces, and as I inlay them, I make sure that I go back and forth and I vary the distance between each piece. That way it doesn't ever look super structured or super patterned. It just is really nice and natural and randomized. So you can do it how you'd like, but that's how I do it. Sometimes I'll do them really close together on opposite sides of the ring. Sometimes I'll do them on the same side but a little bit further apart, or you just kind of get creative with this part and spread them out. Just put them however you'd like. The next step is to add our opal. So for that, I'm just going to dab a little bit of our medium CA adhesive in between some of the pieces of meteorite. I like to do a little bit of a bigger dab and then let it run until it's a little bit thinner. The thinner you can get this layer of medium CA adhesive, the less air bubbles you'll have later on. If you use a really thick glob, it won't allow the color pigment to get in between the pieces of opal, and that will cause air bubbles to form later on. So I like to let it run until it's pretty thin, and then I dump the opal on top of it, and then I lock everything into place with the color pigment. And we repeat that until we've filled the entire inlay channel. After we've done that, we'll use our super thin CA adhesive to saturate the color pigment and add layer after layer of color pigment, saturating in between each layer just to ensure that we don't have any pockets forming where there isn't any color pigment. So I like to do saturate, color pigment, blowing off the excess in between and just slowly adding each layer. Sometimes it'll take a little bit of time, but this is the way that I've found that prevents a lot of air bubbles from forming in my rings. Once we're happy with how filled the inlay channel is, we're going to go ahead and spray it with accelerator to start that curing process. I like to let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. You could let it sit a little bit longer, but I've found that with accelerator, 5 to 10 minutes is a pretty good range of time to have a fully cured ring. After that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the Dremel. So Dremeling on titanium and with meteorite can be a little bit tricky. So as I'm Dremeling, I'm just making sure to use a lot of water because if you overheat the meteorite, it'll cause the CA to melt and it'll rip the meteorite chunk out of your ring, which is super annoying, and it's kind of tricky to fix. It's not that hard, but it's just annoying and a little bit tricky. So I make sure that I use a lot of water to keep everything cool, and then I'm changing out those Dremel bits pretty frequently, just because I've found that a fresh Dremel bit is less likely to tear a piece of meteorite out of the ring. I don't know exactly why that is, but I've found that if I use it for too long, it's more likely to rip the piece of meteorite out. As I'm dremeling with titanium, I also am really careful to keep my Dremel as level as possible, so I don't create any disparities between the level of the ring on either side. Since titanium is a pretty soft metal, you can cause your ring to be uneven if you hold your Dremel at an angle, or if you let it skip, or if you press too hard in one spot. So I'm just making sure to not apply too much pressure and to hold it as level as possible so that I get a nice even finish on the top. With most of the mistakes you make with a Dremel, you can fix it with the sandpaper, but I find that it's easier just to not make the mistake. So try your best to keep the Dremel level and steady, but if you do happen to mess up, just do a little bit extra sanding with your 220 sandpaper and you should be able to get it fixed and buffed out. Once everything's been Dremeled down and it's level, I'm going to go ahead and take a piece of my 220 sandpaper and just do a quick sand. I always do this after I Dremel to level everything off and get a good idea of what the ring looks like. After a good thorough 220, you can usually tell what the ring looks like. It's not going to be polished, but you're going to be able to see some of the more details that were hidden when you were Dremeling. After I do the 220 sand, I always dry it off and I just take a quick look at the ring, make sure that there aren't any big holes, there's no weird discoloration, that I'm happy with how it looks before I move on. So in this one, because there's a lot of opal, I always take a razor blade and just kind of poke around the edges of the opal, because that's where a lot of the air bubbles will form. I didn't find a whole lot, but I made sure to go around the ring and poke most of the opals just to make sure that I didn't have any air pockets that were hidden and that would open up later on. Once I've gone through and checked for extra air bubbles, I go through and fill the little pockets and air bubbles that did form in the ring. And I do that by just pouring a little bit of the color pigment over the ring and then using my finger to wipe off any excess. I find that this causes the color pigment to go down into the air bubbles quite nicely, but it doesn't cause the ring to build back up another layer of the color pigment. It just fills in the holes. So I go all the way around the ring doing that. And then I'll take my super thin CA adhesive and I'll wet down the entire ring and essentially just do another layer over the whole thing to create a nice even level finish and to saturate the air bubbles that we just filled with color pigment. If you don't saturate them, they'll just come back out. So make sure you do this step if you're trying to fill the air bubbles. Once I've allowed that layer of CA to cure, we're going to go ahead and get started with our sanding. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with 220, then 500, and then 1000. Making sure to use water in between each step and during each step to clear away any excess material or excess bits that fall off of the sandpaper, just to make sure that I'm not adding any lines or scratches into the inlay that I just worked so hard to smooth out. Once we're done sanding, we're going to go ahead and polish our ring. I just used the Step 2 Astrotech polish. It's kind of a nice all-in-one polish that gives the ring a really nice finish. Depending on the ring, I'll use steps 1, 2, and 3, but for most rings I can get away with just step 2. So I'm going to go ahead and polish this up, and let's take a look. Alright, I I'm really happy with how this one turned out. I think the daytime color looks really nice. It's a really subtle purple, but when you look at the ring, you can tell that it's purple. I really like that shade of purple, and I think it contrasts nicely with the titanium in the Meteorite, and then it also plays surprisingly well with the Opal. I think the contrast between the gray and the oranges and the purples in the Opal play really well with the daytime color pigment. And I always love the combination of Meteorite and Opal. I think it just looks so cool to have the shiny metal that you know is a piece of Meteorite rock, and then the really cool color shifting Opal. And I really like how this ring turned out. I like the 6mm ring band. I don't think I would wear it at 6mm just because I have pretty big fingers, but I think it's a really nice look, and I'm happy with this ring. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. It was a fun one to make. Alright guys, remember to like and subscribe and join our Facebook group to share your versions of the Calypso ring as well as learn tips and tricks on how to make your own rings. Thanks guys, have a good one.